I just wanted to start today by inviting you just to take a few seconds to think about a turning point in your career, just a moment that changed things for you. So just in your head, don't need to talk to anyone or say anything out loud. Just take a few seconds, think about that. All right. So I did that last week, and someone shouted out when I quit my job. So let's not do any shouting out this week. But the reason I mentioned this is it's going to share a story from my personal career about turning points, and just wanting to try and help you connect with that feeling, that feeling of you've hit a turning point in your career. So turning point happened in 2016. I was working at Salesforce. I was working for some teams in London at Salesforce. And basically, I wrote a book about domain-driven design a couple of years before that. And Salesforce were looking for someone who had expertise in domain-driven design. So they saw that there was a guy in London whose name was on a book about DDD. And they thought, yeah, we'll hire that guy. I didn't have to have an interview. Salary was pretty good. Decent position in the company. So that was the conditions for this turning point. But before I get into the turning point, I just want to point out that just because someone's name's on a book, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're an expert in that topic. So that's a really serious takeaway from this talk. And that leads on to the next thing I wanted to quickly mention. I'm currently working on a new book. Been in the progress for 3 years, and I've got some copies to give away. So anyone who wants to come up at the end of the talk, I've got 3 copies. So you can have one. So let's get back to this turning point. It's 2016. I've been hired by Salesforce because my name was on a book. And the reason they hired me, the reason they wanted someone with domain-driven design skills was because they were facing a challenge that many companies are facing. A big old monolith, difficult to make changes, making changes in one part of the code base and it breaks something somewhere else. These common monolith challenges, and you have the deployment issues, having to deploy the whole thing. One team breaks something and it blocks all the other teams. So having all of those problems, and that was why Salesforce thought we need someone with domain-driven design skills who can wrestle this monolith into some lovely, loosely coupled microservices that will make all of these problems go away. And there is some reasoning to that logic. There was some reasonable decision making going on there. And so, thinking conceptually, thinking about what the problem they had was, the common problem we see in these situations, the reason they wanted someone with domain expertise was when we looked at how the business, when we thought about the different aspects of the business, we saw things in one shape. I'll move out of the way a bit. But when we looked at the software, the way the software had been organized around different concepts, it had a bit of a different shape. And so the result of this is when we don't have those boundaries lined up between our domains and our software, when we want to implement a feature, we have to touch different parts of the code base. And so that's the coupling, basically. That's one of the key problems we have with monoliths and legacy systems. They're not aligned to the domain boundaries. And so making a change, we have to touch multiple parts of the code base. So the solution, everyone thought at that time in that company was if we just sprinkle on a bit of domain-driven design, we identify these domain boundaries, and then we just make the code align to these domain boundaries, we'll want to make a change in this part of the business, in this subdomain, let's say, and we'll have to touch one part of the code base. That's the holy grail, and then we can just deploy one part of the code base. So this was my job. This was when I got to the turning point in my career. I was responsible for getting from this to this because my name was on a book. I had all of this responsibility because my name was on a book. And I'm not exaggerating that much here, but a little bit maybe. So this is the turning point, basically. I realized to get the code base looking like those domain boundaries, that was possible, that was doable. We had some different perspectives on what the domain boundaries could be. But with each of those options we identified, there was something that still wouldn't fix this problem. And the problem was the team boundaries, as you can see here. So every option involved Well, it didn't involve changing the teams, but it would require to change the teams. So basically, the problem was, we could have the code and the domain aligned, but the teams would still be aligned to the old domain boundaries. So we would still have teams touching multiple parts of the code. So that was when I realized, if you're a software architect, you have to change the team boundaries as well. You can't just change the software and ignore the teams. So a lot of people will say, well, that's just Conway's law, right? But at the time, I wasn't really thinking about these things, and it was quite a big turning point. And when I spoke to the manager, I felt some friction there. He was like, well, you've been hired to deal with the software. I didn't hire you to start messing around with the teams. We spent a lot of time building these teams, picking people who work well together, picking people who have certain skills. These teams have been working together for, some of them quite a few years together in different parts of the system. And so if you want to start changing the software, that's what you're here for, but we can't go messing around with the teams. So that was the key turning point. I realized that trying to get these things lined up, and that's what we need to do, all three of them, the domain aspect, the team aspect, and the software aspect, and then that will give us the one slice through. So from that point on, it was really a big topic in my mind, thinking about those things. Has anyone else written about this stuff? Is anyone else out there thinking about the teams and the software? Apart from Conway, who I hadn't really got into Melvin Conway at this point. So we used concepts like socio-technical for a few years, trying to figure out what to call this software and teams at the same time. And I think it was around 2019 when team topologies came out. One of the core concepts in team topologies is the concept of a value stream. It's basically the sequence of activities a team goes through to discover and deliver value. This is quite a high-level overview, and the idea is to try and get fast flow. And I realized that this is actually what companies are looking for. When I worked at Salesforce, what they wanted was fast flow. This monolith was a problem, and they thought DDD could help them get fast flow, and it could, but it was only one part of the picture. So when team topologies came along in 2019, it wasn't a revolution that changed everything, but it was kind of that moment where the pieces start to fall into place and we have a different mental model for thinking about things. And so I think that now with team topologies, we have this concept of a value stream, and in particular an independent value stream. I think this is the building blocks of modern architecture. If I could go back to 2016, before my turning point, this is the concept I needed in my head. I needed to be thinking about 4 different things. So yes, we need the DDD aspect, the domain-aligned aspects. We also need to be outcome-oriented. So these value streams aren't just requirements in and working code out of the end. We want to be outcome-oriented because that will enable teams to make decisions faster. And then, as I talked about in the Salesforce example, the team has to be aligned and able to make decisions in their value stream. And of course, the third part I talked about was the software, having the software aligned. So I'm going to talk about these different aspects in the talk today, but the key thing I wanted to get across is I think that in a modern context, when we're looking to create loosely coupled software and achieve fast flow, I think we have to think about all of these things together: the domain, the business aspects, the team aspect, and the software aspect. So before we get into those things, I'll just quickly say that this is it's a bit of a high-level talk. I'm going to touch on those different areas, so I'm not going to be able to go deep into all of those different concepts, but there are some links in the talk to find out more. So let's get into the first bit, the domain-aligned bit. So each value stream, each independent value stream, is set up to create value in a particular business subdomain. So as a modern architect, I think you need the ability to actually understand how to identify domain boundaries. It's not as easy as it looks. So the first thing I would say is there are different ways of splitting up your business into domains and subdomains. In this example here, we have some abstract concepts, and we can group them in different ways by shape and size and color and weight and material, many combinations here. And that's the same with most businesses. We have to think about which way of looking at the business makes sense based on what we know at the moment, the challenges we're facing right now. So there are different heuristics for slicing up your business into domains and subdomains. The first one is a very simple heuristic, which is basically take some process or user journey, and each step in that journey is a subdomain. In this example here, we've got search and browse, product details, cart and checkout reviews. Those are potential, they could be candidate subdomains in your business if you had a place order journey. We can also go a different way. We might see concepts that are repeating in these different subdomains or these different steps, and we might say, actually, we want to extract those into a centralized domain. Anything related to this concept, in this example, notifications, we want to pull it out of those subdomains and have it in its own separate subdomain. There might be reasons to do that and reasons not to do that. Then we've got another example here. So we have this concept of a customer, and the customer appears in 3 different subdomains. Could be more. We've got marketing, journeys, and maintenance. So we could apply that centralization heuristic here. We could extract that customer into a customer domain. Has anyone ever worked at a company with a customer domain? How did that work out? Yeah, I see this all the time, this customer domain. But what we can do instead, before we start, we don't always want to extract everything into these centralized subdomains. Sometimes we can look for more specialized terminology, more specialized versions of a concept, and use that as a heuristic for finding domain boundaries. So in this example, we can ask people who care about marketing, or even just look at the way they talk about their work, and they might not use the word customer. We might be talking about the same person, but they might call them a lead. In journeys, they might call them a rider, and in maintenance, a reporter. So we can use these specialized versions of a concept as heuristics for domain boundaries. And that contrasts with the previous one about centralization. We also have the concept of roles. Other people have spoken about this, and they give it slightly different names, but the concept is fairly similar. We basically look at the different kinds of responsibilities or roles in a domain and use the boundary between different roles as a way to identify boundaries. In this example here, we've got advertising campaigns. So building an advertising campaign, that's kind of a specification. You're describing, I want to run a campaign with, these are the creatives, here's the target audience, here's how much I'm prepared to pay. You're describing what you want to happen. Nothing's actually happened at that point. You're saying, I'd like to have this advertising campaign. And that might be sufficiently complex that you could say this whole process of building specification, that can be its own separate subdomain. Not always, but sometimes. And then we have the next one is execution. Take that specification and actually execute some process to make that specification deliver what the specification describes, basically. So those are 4 different heuristics. Let's need a quick drink. Those are 4 different heuristics. And it might seem like you can just apply those heuristics easily, but actually choosing the best heuristic is about getting into the details, really looking at the way people talk about domains, mapping out these processes, mapping out lots of different edge cases and use cases. So if you haven't heard of techniques like event storming, I think that's definitely something you should go away and learn. A lot of people have heard of it. At this conference, I imagine, there's a lot of DDD people, so I'm not going to talk about event storming, but if the concept of domains and domain boundaries and heuristics is appealing to you and you haven't heard of event storming, definitely go check out this technique. There's also a conference here called Como Camp for people who like this kind of stuff, a great place to meet people and try these concepts out. So the next part of independent value streams, we've identified possible domain boundaries where we can set up a value stream. That's the first step in the process. Where might this value stream be set up to create value? But then we need to understand, like, from a business perspective, have we chosen the right domain boundaries? This quote from Anna Shipman is a good one. It's quite simple, but it gets the point across. There's no point having a tech strategy about reducing costs if the business strategy is about building new products. I see this disconnect quite often. I was working with a client a few months ago, and on one side, had some of the products and senior leaders who were saying, we want to double the company's revenue in 5 years. very ambitious language. I got the impression like that if you had a good idea, they'd put the money behind it to make it happen. So, very ambitious. And it was a 150-year-old company, not like a small startup. Doubling a company's revenue at that size, it's pretty difficult. When I spoke to the developers, they were thinking like, yeah, we could one or two more developers might help us to get features delivered quicker, fix technical debt a bit quicker. So a huge disconnect there. So I think it's important to make sure we've got those clear business outcomes. What are we optimizing for? So I think that's a key skill for modern architects, able to understand for each of these value streams you're setting up, what are the business outcomes it's contributing to? Is it revenue, customer acquisition, customer lifetime value, engagement, retention? What are the outcomes that this value stream is optimizing for? So one of the simplest techniques that can help you to start having these conversations is Ansoff's matrix, a really simple grid talking about products and markets. You might have different of these going on in your company, different strategies at any one point, but it's a simple idea. Are we going to be growing our existing products or building new products? Are we targeting new customers or delivering more for our existing customers? Just that starting point, just that framing can help you get off on the right path and understand which outcomes you're optimizing for. So let's have a look at an example. Here's an example from BBC. I haven't worked with BBC, but I like this example because it's public and it fits with my diagram from the previous slides. You can read about this on their website. It's in the public space. So basically, at this point in time here, BBC is organized vertically. They consider their domains to be children's, education, home, news, sports, and weather. Organization structure, software, that's what those things are aligned to. But now people are starting to ask questions. We can see these concepts of topics and search and articles appearing in these different domains, and they're wondering, is this the point where we should apply that centralization heuristic? We've got the vertical and the horizontal, currently vertical, should we be horizontal? What's the right way to slice things at the point we are now? Historically, this might have been the right choice, but where we are now, what's the right way to slice our value streams? So they did go for the horizontal, but what's important about this example is the reasoning they're using here. They wanted to build shared horizontal capabilities and share commodity components between the teams. So what they're saying is we're going to create these vertical value streams, these horizontal value streams, these platforms. And the reason is we believe that these concepts are commodity. We believe that they're going to be very similar across these different verticals. So it makes sense to have one version of those things and not let each vertical duplicate their own. And then in the second part of this quote, they're saying by doing this, by cutting some cost there and centralizing things, that would allow those vertical teams to build more innovative features for their audience. So a couple of outcomes here. They do want to build more innovative features for their audience, and they see these horizontals as enabling some time to market and cost reduction that frees up things in the verticals. I'm sure if we spoke to BBC, the conversation will be much more detailed than this. There's a lot of numbers we don't have here, but that's a good example of we've got these architectural choices about how to organize our domains, and we're making these choices based on clear strategic outcomes we're optimizing for. So as an architect, if you're not naturally someone who's been thinking about the bigger picture perspective, it is important. Every architectural decision made on an individual team or domain level, it needs to be connected back to the bigger picture. How does it fit into the bigger picture? So one of the techniques I use is called core domain charts, based on domain-driven design. It's a way to map out your portfolio of domains and subdomains. I think about what are we focusing on, and where do other value streams fit in a supporting role. So in the BBC example, we might say the horizontals they were talking about, maybe they're supporting. By consolidating those, it enables them to do more things in their core domains, which we don't actually know what their core domains were in that example. So great technique, fairly simple, I highly recommend it, but you need some technique for a portfolio perspective. That's the key thing here. There's also Wardley mapping, which is a bit more advanced. But there's another important reason to be thinking about business outcomes for our value streams. And it's because being outcome-oriented unlocks the team's potential. I've got another quote for you here from Marty Kagan, which demonstrates this point. So he says, if you're just using your engineers to code, you're only getting about half of their value. And what he's trying to say is that getting the whole team involved in product discovery, user research, feature discovery, feature design, what he's seeing from a product management perspective is that that's the best way to build products. And that's why we want to have these outcomes. So if we have outcomes for our value streams, if we have clear business outcomes, that's the team's objective. The team can then make decisions that they think is best and make faster decisions toward those outcomes. I've worked in these teams, even in the UK government, so I agree with Marty's perspective. I'm not just picking his quote because it's nice, because it matches my experiences. So I think a modern architect, what have we talked? We've talked about domain skills, we've talked about business outcomes, we've talked about having a portfolio perspective. I think for a modern architect, it's also equally crucial to be understanding what a good team looks like, how modern teams work, how empowered teams work, and how architecture fits into that part of the picture. So here's one of the techniques I use in my workshops as a consultant. I have this line, and I ask people which of these things is more important. On this side, we've got architecture and strategy, and over here, we've got skilled and empowered teams. And these workshops contain a mix of people, technical people, architects, product people, leaders. But what you can see here is pretty accurate in all of those workshops. Most people are closer to the teams than the fence. So if you're an architect and you're thinking, I'm going to focus just on the technical bit, you're working in that bit over there, which people think is the least important part. So, I'm not saying architecture is not important, but I'm just saying probably want to be over here a bit. Not all the way over here, but you probably want to be operating in this space a bit. So we've got this great diagram from John Cutler, and this can help you to reflect on where you are as a company and where you want to get to. This is also a good workshop technique. Put a dot where you are now and put a dot where you'd like to get to. So it's a nice model for reflecting on how your teams currently operate and how far away you are from the bottom here, where every decision inside your value stream is made by the team themselves or largely by the team themselves. If you're looking for something a bit more concrete that you can apply to your architecture, I'm a big fan of independent value stream, independent service heuristics from Team Topologies. I did a talk about this with Matthew Skelton last year. You can watch the talk online in a bit more detail. But it's basically a checklist. I don't want to oversell a checklist. It's not something big and amazing, but sometimes a simple checklist is all you really need. And this checklist helps you to think about different aspects of your team and your business and your architecture to make sure you're covering all of the key points. So we did this with a client, an American client, and we were going through the checklist and we got to points 4 and points 10. So we're talking about costs and how a team makes decisions. And what we found was the team didn't have a budget. Wait, how can a team not have a budget? Who's paying the salaries? Basically, this was a horizontal team, and their budget came from the vertical teams who needed stuff. So basically, a vertical team wants some new capability, and they say to the horizontal team, yeah, we'll give you some money to build it. So basically, this horizontal team could only build exactly what another team would pay them to build. They didn't have their own budget to figure out, what do we think is the best in the long term for the company? What kind of things might we want to build in a more generalizable fashion? It was kind of, they need it, you build what they need, and they'll pay you only enough how they want it. So, it's kind of like an outsourcing model, asking to build to requirements. So by going through this heuristics, we uncovered this issue, and so we started digging into this. Where's this coming from? Why does this budget arrangement exist? And I was having a conversation with the CEO, and he basically said to me, a few years ago, he was on some project and some platform team went away for 3 years and built nothing, and it was a disaster project. And now he's determined to never let that happen again. So he's going to take away all this team's autonomy so that can't happen here. So, he had a valid point. These platform projects can go for years and deliver nothing. I've got a client now who's kind of in that situation. But the point is, just by going through this checklist of heuristics, you can uncover things on the team side, on the organizational side, that as an architect, you might not naturally find yourself digging into. So a big fan of the ISH. And again, if Teams isn't your strong point, I find these 4 books incredibly useful. And I would probably also say go to a product management conference. Think about how modern product management works. You can learn a lot in that space. So the last part is software decoupled. I think we're okay on time for this. So the first thing I would say about this part of value streams is I think modern architects need to have a vocabulary for talking about coupling and complexity. I mean, a lot of workshops about architecture, and very often I'll hear something like, "Oh no, those 2 things are coupled. That's not good." It's like coupling is an on-off switch. Oh, you've got some coupling there. Sorry, son, you've got to throw the whole architecture away and start again. But actually, coupling is a very nuanced topic. There's a lot of different factors to consider, and not all coupling is equal. And I think the work Vladik Kononov is doing in this space is something that we can all look at and take inspiration from. So he talks, firstly, one of the concepts he talks about is the pain of a dependency, a single dependency. He talks about strength, volatility, and distance. I'll come back to strength in a minute, but volatility is basically how often do 2 things change together. So in a workshop sometime last year, I had this common thing as a consultant. Someone else probably heard this as well, where someone says, "Oh, it's impossible to break our system up into smaller pieces. Everything's coupled to everything. It's just completely impossible. Everyone's tried. Everyone's failed. It's impossible. We just have to have a monolith, a big ball of mud. There's no other choice here. Everything touches everything." So I said to the guy, "Okay, let's draw something on a whiteboard." So I said, "Just draw these different things on a whiteboard." So he draws this one big bit in the middle, and he draws these 30 different things coming off it. And I said, "Okay, how often do you make changes in that and that together?" And he went, "Oh, we wrote that a couple of years ago and haven't touched it since." I'm like, "Great." The volatility that the frequency that those 2 things change together is so low that you can decouple them very easily. Because even if you do have to change something, it's going to be once every 2 years. Very small pain. That's volatility. We can assess a dependency based on its volatility. We can also assess a dependency based on its distance. So the example here that Vladik gives is two variables in the same method. Right next to each other, distance is very low. Therefore, if we do have to make a change that involves those 2 concepts, they're so close together that the risk and the difficulty of that change will be easier. On the other hand, if we're talking about different bits of code in different services owned by different teams that work in different countries and different time zones, that's quite a big technical and social distance. So that would be more of a more difficult dependency. So let's get to what he talks about coupling strength, because I think this is very interesting. I think there's a lot going on in here, but I do think the idea is a good one. So intrusive coupling, this is what he calls the most, and he's still figuring out these names, so these might change. That's what he calls the strongest form of coupling. It's where one component knows a lot about another component. So basically, if you make any change in this component over here, this component over here knows about that and will break. He then gets to functional coupling, which is basically when you change the rules or perhaps the order of a certain operations in a certain component, that will break another one. It depends on the way you do things. It's not coupled to your code per se, but how you do things. Then there's a weaker form of coupling, which is called model coupling, which is how much of your domain model in this component does this component know about? How much of your domain model can you easily change? And then he gets to the weakest form of coupling, which is contract coupling. And basically, this component here has a very small, it doesn't have to be a small interface, but the interface is the only thing the other component knows about. Anything behind the interface you can change very easily as long as the contract remains. That's contract coupling. You've probably heard of these things before, but what I like about what Vladik's done is he's given them names and a bit of a model that we can use. And again, in workshops, when people talk about coupling, oh, there's coupling there. That's bad. hey, wait, it's just contract coupling. It's good, no problem. We can have more sensible conversations. What he's also done, he's been talking about local versus global complexity. This is about the size of things, which I find very interesting. We can have more mature conversations here as well. So if we break our system down into lots of small components, then each component in itself will be simpler. The local complexity will be lower, but the global complexity of the system, due to more pieces and more dependencies, will be higher. And it's the inverse if you have larger but fewer pieces. So again, we can use this in our conversations. Someone might say, oh, this solution's simpler. And we can say, well, locally it's simpler, but globally it's actually much more complex. So let's try and balance those things a bit more. All right, so next one is going back to the domain concept a bit, but I think modern architects need to let the domain drive the software architecture. This is different to what I was talking about before. So one of the problems I have is, as a consultant, for example, talking with some teams, like, can you talk to me about your architecture? Explain how your system works. And they'll start talking about databases and these funny names like Snowflake and Phoenix. Everyone's got a Phoenix project and a bunch of these other things that don't really make sense. And it takes a long time to figure out, what is this software actually doing? Like, what are the capabilities here? All I'm seeing is technical names and HTTP protocols and gRPC all over the place. So here's a technique you can use. It's called domain message flow modeling. And basically what we've got here, we've got a software architecture here. And we've designed and we've described the whole system using only domain terminology. Technical details are important. Protocols are important. Your pet names for your services, they might be important to you. But actually, when we want to understand what your system does, this is the kind of way we should be designing our systems. So you can see in this example, it's winning a car at an auction. We've got the acquisition crew using a tablet app. Tablet app makes a query to the inspection subdomain. Get me the details for this inspection that I need to perform on this car. And then it will upload the inspection results, complete inspection. Once that's done, the inspection subdomain, the service, the software responsible that represents that service will publish an event saying inspection completed. And you can see the remaining steps. To me, this is very simple, but sometimes it's actually very hard to do this. Just trying to go through this process, people always want to bring back the database or the message bus, and it's like, no, let's just not do that for now. Let's just go through these steps. And a lot of these problems that people are having are with the coupling in their system. Actually, when you do things this way, they can see it for themselves pretty quickly. So I don't think it's a difficult skill, but I think it's an important skill. And the final part, I would say, so far in this talk, it's all been about post-its and diagrams and, arm wavy stuff. But I think modern architecture should be data-driven. It can be data-driven. But I don't think all of the tools out there are your friends. And I think there are a lot of tools where architects go away and work in their teams and create models of the system that no one else really sees or uses. I'm a bit skeptical of those tools. So basically, my heuristic is, if it's got Adam Thornhill's name on it, it's probably a good tool to use. You can probably trust it if his name's on it. For example, I started work with a new client a few weeks ago. There's a new CTO who's come in. CTO is trying to figure out, where's the system, where are the problems, where are the challenges. He uses code scene. This isn't the example I'm talking about. And he's like, oh, I think it's like 80% of the code is only touched by contractors. If we fire those contractors because we're trying to save a bit of money, we're going to lose knowledge of how 80% of our system works. That's what these kind of tools can give you these days. So, we do need to be data-driven. It's not all about the post-its and the arm waving. We do need to be a bit sensible about things. So that's basically it. I'm just going to quickly recap those things, and then I'll let you all go for your next talk and your next break. So I think, my turning point in my career was I realized you have to connect to those three different dots: the software, the domain, and the teams. Most of you nowadays, Conway's Law, it's pretty normal stuff, pretty common, but for me, that was a big turning point. And in my work, in my experience, in how I'm working now, I'm using this concept of independent value streams as the building block, as the main concept, because I know when I talk about this concept, I'm talking about domains, outcomes, teams, and software. And those are the 4 key things I find. If you've got to focus on all 4 of those things, you're probably not missing too much. That covers most of the important things about architecting. So yeah, just to recap on those things I said about architects, dot connectors. So if you're going to be an architect these days, I think it is about connecting these different dots. So thank you very much for attending this talk. We have time for questions. Anyone have a question?
There's a lot of very specific and niche skills in these teams. You start slicing them. These guys are either very shared, or the team that gets them is the one that gets things done. How do we go around the small teams problem?
The small teams problem in terms of why would you have a small team? That's my first question.
Start slicing by dependent service values, value propositions.
Okay.
Smaller teams, and then the key guys, the key skills cannot be everywhere.
Well, I think that goes back to local versus global complexity, right? We don't have to slice things small. We can set a size that's appropriate. We could have teams that own multiple smaller value streams as well if we need to. So I'm kind of. It's not very common that I'll be having I would recommend a team of more than 5 or 6 people. Well, maybe 4 people. So I think I would rather have, as a general, I'd rather have one team that owns 2 things rather than 2 small teams that each own 1 thing. And I think, yeah, if you do go smaller, yeah, you'll have the issue where there's more coupling you'll have more global complexity. So sizing is important. I wouldn't say never have small teams, but I think we can control the size of things. So in that example, yeah, maybe I'd go towards a bit more, I'd reduce the global complexity. Did that answer the question, or did I avoid answering the question? Okay, we can talk about this after if you like. Hey.
During your talk, you were talking about the architects versus architecture, making some architecture all together.
Yeah. So this is probably a topic that Eduardo de Silva is leading at the moment. When I talk about architects, I'm talking about anyone who's making architectural decisions. In the work he's been doing, he's been talking about different architecture team topologies. So yeah, you've got a centralized architect, you've got everyone's an architect. That's something that he's been talking about recently. I'd recommend his stuff. I'm probably more towards, more teams making more decisions for themselves. But there is a need for some, coordination and standardization at some level. All right. Any more questions? His name's Eduardo de Silva. I think his website's esilva.net. What's wrong with my old book? Well, if you buy my old book, you might not buy my new book, so... All right. Any final questions? Did I just say that out loud? Oh, did you have a question? One final question? No? Okay, that's it. Oh, sorry.
At the end of the talk, you say choose your tools wisely for architecture. Do you have maybe some examples of tools or practices that you don't recommend doing?
Yeah, so, when I go to some workshop sometimes there are people who are like, we don't need to do this workshop because I've already mapped all this out on my own and I've got these processes all mapped out inside some tool. Usually talking more in towards the enterprise architecture, business process modeling space there. I'm not going to say all people in that space are bad because I do work with a lot of enterprise architects and business architects who are open to these approaches as well. But yeah, it's any kind of tool that pitches itself as a replacement for collaboration and visual discovery. Those tools can be useful, but they're not a replacement. That's kind of the area I'm not too keen on. All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone.